Good morning, everyone. I'm sure many people in this room know what big data is, and this morning we're going to be talking about something called little data. We're going to talk about what it is, why it matters for OT, and how to get it. So with that, let's just first establish a shared definition of what big data is. I'm sure many people here know what it is, but just for the purposes of the next 30 or so minutes together, think of big data as when you bring a lot of information together that by definition is unreadable, ununderstandable to a human, and that's why you bring machines in the loop. And some examples of that in OT, and I'm sure this has come up at S4s in the past, are we've used big data in the past around metrics like performance and utilization, and when you bring all this information together from equipment, you can start to do really exciting analysis around which of these devices are being used the most, which are not being used the most, and then you can start to redistribute them based on where demand is. In addition to where big data is showing up around equipment, you're also seeing big data show up within the equipment itself. A great example of this is using security cameras. We've started to think about how do you update the filters of a security camera in real time to more finely tune the image that you're getting. And I'm sure if we sat here, we could hear a lot more examples from everyone else in this room of how you're seeing big data show up within your own organization. But the problem is, regardless of the type of data that you have, whether it's performance information, utilization, information coming off of something like a camera, it's still really hard to take any type of insight and really form it and put it into action. And that underlying problem isn't something that's wrong with the big data itself, it's just this lack of this other type of information, and that information is something called little data, the thing that is connecting people like you and me, into the insight, into something that's informative, in something that's like human readable, and actually put it into action within the organization. So taking that redistribution example from before about how we were using performance information and utilization information to move devices, before you even actually move a device, someone like anybody else in this room first has to think, is this device plugged into a wall? How heavy is it? Where is it located? And you may or may not realize that you're using this information to actually make a decision about whether you're going to be moving it. But those are the examples of the little data that's really important in these different environments. And then looking below at this Allen Bradley PLC right here, big data, really useful to identifying the device. Say you've looked at the behavior of the device, you've looked at all the products that this vendor makes, and you can identify it. And then, hey, you've got a vulnerability, you've brought that in from multiple different data sources, such as the MITRE CVE database, or you've brought it in from CISA alerts. But to take and do any type of action, like patch that device or segment it, there's a whole host of other information that's needed to go from that insight and move that into an action. And you're seeing just a few examples of that here. And we've heard this statistic from organizations that 97% of enterprises have trouble going from big data and getting value and putting that within your organization. And what are some of those underlying problems, and why is it so hard to go from big data and actually put it into action within your organization? And we can bucket this across these three different categories. One of them is just disparate systems, one of them is just being super unstructured, and then the last one being undocumented. What do these mean? So first, just talking about disparate systems. It would be one thing if little data just lived in different pieces of software and it was a matter of just integrating that software into one another. It's a hard problem, but it's something that is solvable and countable and you could do. The reality is that information lives across emails and PDFs and even files behind people's desks that have never even been digitized, and so it's really hard to bring it together. The second piece around being unstructured, it's one thing that the fact that emails and PDFs don't talk well to one another. That's one piece of why this data is hard to bring together. But there's another notion and another dimension to this, which is This information, take something like location, can mean two different things depending on the different types of stakeholders that you're talking to. So location, for example, when you talk to an IT director, can mean something like a subnet or a VLAN, but when you go and you talk to an OT engineer, maybe they're thinking about a specific plant, maybe they're thinking about a specific production line, and all of a sudden this information that needs to flow together is meaning two different things to two very different types of people. And then finally, a lot of little data is just undocumented. Information that you're using every day, whether you realize it or not, is probably this semblance of little data, and and you're not realizing that you're using it when you actually are. So a great example of this is I once got on the phone with a facilities manager and was asking him, what do you do when this HVAC goes down? And he's like, oh, I just always call John Doe over here. And if this facilities manager is ever out for the day or were to leave and this HVAC were to go down, there's no paper trail of where that information is living. And you start to get this sense that, that this is happening all over the organization, and this little data is really important within these different types of actions. And a few different examples of just how this little data can really make or break the difference when doing some type of security actions or operations actions. We're going to look at some examples of the consequences that happen when we don't have this little data at our disposal. So in this first example, this is happening at NASA, the government agency that's brought us spaceships and a lot of great astronomy research. They had this situation where they applied a patch, they applied it uniformly, and it impacted this OT component that happened to be controlling a very large engineering oven. And when they implemented this patch, it caused the oven to reboot, the oven turned off, it caused a fire, and then the respective alarm also went out, and it caused this fire to go undetected for 3.5 hours. We also have this other scenario at this large wafer manufacturer, and they had this scenario where they were doing this ping sweep and they were trying to identify hosts on the network for inventory purposes. And as they did this ping sweep, it caused this very integrated circuit to hang, and the resulting downtime came with a loss of over $50,000 worth of wafers. And a lot of people in this room know that one size fits all is not a good approach to OT, but little data really thinks about and demands you take it a step further and really think about the nuances and the complexities that come within these environments, as every device is different based on vendor and version and use. And as the world only gets more connected and gets more complex, it's that much more important that we think about how are we making it even easier for the humans who are in the loop to understand. And so as we start to think about on a solution side of this, how do we get to a place where we have better hygiene towards collecting little data? It really starts by thinking about how are we breaking down the silos. And we'll look through a couple of these different examples and see this pattern play out. So when you take something like a new vulnerability, which is coming off of big data, you've brought a lot of different data sources together. Anytime you want to implement an action on that new vulnerability, say you want to patch it, it's going to come down to, are you the one that's going to patch it? Maybe you've got some devices that the vendor is going to actually be the one responsible for the patching. And for that, maybe you have to go back to that original source of the contract and where those lines were drawn. Or you've got this example of changes in performance, and maybe you want to move the device, figure out where the location is, and a network engineer, a security engineer, a facilities person may not have that information at their disposal, and they're going to have to go to a plant manufacturer or that asset owner. And the common theme across all of these is that this is information that is living outside of people's typical domain, and they're going to have to work with other people outside of the organization. So as we think about how we are harnessing little data, remembering that it's really moving the organization forward and how we're making it a lot easier for them to work across different teams and these different silos. Now, jumping into a framework that we can use in how we're going to get to little data, and then we'll walk through a very specific example that we've walked through in how we helped an organization get that little data even more easily at their disposal as they were doing security actions and operations actions. So this first one is wanting to plan, and I cannot stress this enough, but pick a single process that today probably takes a lot of time, is really critical, and really think about the data that you're using within that process. And this is an example where there's probably data that you already know you're using on an everyday basis to answer those questions, but it's very likely there's data you don't realize that you're using. Think about who's the person that you call the most often. Is there a chain of emails that's sort of stretching out over time that's holding information? And you want to start to map out what that information is. And one of the reasons for picking a single process versus trying to boil the whole ocean and get rid of spreadsheets and try to do everything automated is it helps create the right urgency across the different stakeholders for seeing this all the way through the end. Then the second step is around integration. And I think when people hear integration, they think one source of truth, they think bringing all this information into one place. Sure, that's one example of it, but integration can also just be a series of steps, a continuum of how data is going to flow from one to the other. And I know this is so much easier said than done, and so as you think about how you're going to get data moving from one place to another, remembering to make it extremely easy to use, extremely flexible, so that you're not spending a ton of time on that engineering overhead and spending more time on the high-value insights and actions that you're trying to take. And then this third step, the embedding step, this is where we start to see a lot of people either neglect this step or miss this step, and this is one of the most important pieces as you think about bringing little data to bear on these big data insights. So in this embedding step, what we mean by this is you want to think about where is this information changing, where is it getting updated, and how do you move data collection as close to the source as possible. So if you take something like updating the location of the device, it's one thing to put an asset owner on that, make it their job to update the location of the device, but you start to see how that's really fragmented because they may not be the one that's physically moving it. So how do you make it so that the facilities person or the asset owner who's going to be physically moving that device be the one who's going to ultimately be responsible for updating that location? Maybe it's through tablets, maybe it's through Bluetooth beacons, whatever it is, getting it as close and as decentralized to where data collection is happening within the organization. And so in that, there's these two key ways that you can think about embedding it into this process. The first one is making little data collection accessible to different types of stakeholders, because if you only make little data accessible to the people who are going to be using it, security, operations, you're going to miss out on those insights from the people who are actually on the ground, touching and interacting with these devices on a day-to-day basis. And the second piece is around permissions. So permissions are great because they often check a box for the company. Maybe your company just generally has certain restrictions around how data is used. But permissions can also be really helpful for helping have better hygiene within the data itself. So if you think about how permissions help highlight the gaps of who owns what, maybe it wasn't clear beforehand, permissions can also be really helpful on who can read, write, and edit certain types of data. And if you're consistent with that over time, you can start to weed out some of those errors that might exist within your data in the first place, such as where Philips has one L in one place and two L's at the other place, and I'm sure we've all experienced that in some form or fashion. And then finally, remembering that this is an evolving process, and it's going to evolve in essentially two different ways. One, whatever process you're starting with that you're trying to improve and trying to get access to that little data a lot more easily, you're going to recognize that there's some gaps in it, there's going to be some data that you didn't realize you were going to need, and you want to bring that in over time. The second piece is, as you want to move this out across the entire organization, it's going to be evolving, and starting with a single process is going to have that spider web effect and start to touch on additional processes that you can bring into this framework as well. And there's two ways that you can think about how do you have this spider web effect, how do you go from one to many of better little data collection. The first one, and this is my favorite, is if you're using Slack, if you're using Discord, or you've got some other collaboration tool within the company, just setting up a channel where it can be called the process channel, where people who, as they're going about their day, realize they had to go outside of a process to find some information. Maybe they had to reach out to John Doe and ask for the product specifications, and it would be a lot easier if they had that product specifications within the tool that they were using, whether it was in a Google Drive that they check every day, and putting that in the Slack channel, in the Discord channel, and highlighting that, hey, we need to bring this missing data into this existing process. That's one way. A second great way to do it is just having a reoccurring meeting where instead of looking forward and what your team or teams are trying to accomplish, and just outright addressing where are the places where we had some gaps in the data that we were trying to do our day-to-day that we could bring into our existing processes. And if you get this right, what you'll start to notice is the data that you're bringing together will evolve over time. The tools that you're bringing together, maybe you started with 2 and you realize you need to bring in a third, and also the types of people that you're going to be bringing in over time will also start to evolve. And we can see this in a very specific example. So we have the opportunity in working with organizations and help them with a lot of OT data, fill in some context, take some action within security and operations domains. And a great example of this is something like onboarding devices. So you can think about organizations that you've worked with today or the organization that you're at and ask yourself, like, how are you onboarding devices? Is it the Wild West? Is it, do you have a procurement process, but that procurement process starts to break down as it translates into security or operations? And with this specific organization, we were asking similar questions around what's taking you the most time, what's super critical today, and they walked us through their onboarding process. So it typically goes with maintenance and operations has purchased something like a point of sale system or a sprinkler or even a vending machine. And they call the network team and they say, hey, the vendor is here right now. We need to get this online stat. And of course, the network team is like, we have to drop what we're doing. We were doing this migration, and all of a sudden now we're onboarding this device. Where is it going to live? Who's going to own it? Is this an approved vendor? And they're trying to get all this information in real time. It's a ton of back and forth. There's additional approvals that are needed in certain cases where if it's a vendor they haven't bought from before, they have to bring that in. And something that should be able to happen in an instant as they're trying to get this device online starts to span out over several hours, several days, and it's a much further point from when it actually comes online. And even beyond that, the challenges don't end there, because anytime something bad happens in the network, something goes down, the network engineer, the operations teams are trying to recall, and we've all experienced this before, where we're trying to remember the words that we used in an email to find it in our inbox. They're trying to do a very similar thing. What was the MAC address? What was the vendor? What is this on my network? How did it get here? Who's accountable? And it really slows down, you can imagine, both their ability to purchase and bring in new devices, but it also just slows down their ability to respond to threats and just changes within the network in real time. So we sat down with them, we understood concerns in these different stakeholders and the types of data that they were going to need, both that they were using today. There was a real paper trail that lived in email and lived in people's mental model that they were using on a day-to-day basis that we could bring in, and then also being able to be forward-looking and consider what are the questions you wish you could answer when something goes down. Brought that in, mapped it out, actually brought it into a form. And this is where you start to see that ease of use, flexibility. It doesn't have to be anything special. It can be a Google form, it can be a Microsoft form, and setting certain permissions around who can fill out which questions, setting out a certain flow of after certain questions are answered, then people can come in and approve aspects of this process, so that anytime a new device is added to the network, anybody from maintenance and operations, facilities, even an executive can fill out this process and bring it on the network. And that's where you start to see the accessibility to different stakeholders. Things are happening in real time at the place of purchase, decentralized across the organization. And then finally, anytime something bad happened, because this information is flowing into respective dashboards, not one system, but actually respective separate pages tailored to networking, security, operations, it was much easier for folks to figure out in real time, who do we contact, how do we solve this? And over time, helping the organization more quickly adopt new technology, save them a bunch of manual work, and then ultimately respond to these threats much more quickly and in real time. So as we think about big data, we know it's not going anywhere. We know that it's here to stay. We love it. But just don't forget that with all of this big data, we also need to be thinking about how are we going to be bringing in that little data and making sure that little data isn't being left behind. And if we get it right, if we put some practices in place and really put a concerted effort on how we're keeping track of it, it has the real benefit of not only minimizing the downside, we're here and we can talk about security events and how we can respond to them much more quickly, but also maximizing the upside, saving people a ton of manual work, a lot of headache, and much more easily using how they're using inventory and maximize investment within existing systems. So That's what we wanted to get through today. Happy to continue the discussion via Q&A, via the app, or finding me afterwards. I ask that you go to one of these microphones if you're going to ask any type of questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
When you were implementing that example, what kind of resistance did you get from the employees initially, and at what point did they turn around and see the value of that process? Because it requires them to document things they don't normally document in a standardized format, and there's generally resistance to that kind of documentation. So at what point did they get that, wow, this is worth it?
It's a great question. So for folks, just to say it back to everyone, it's around when you're trying to collect little data and get it as decentralized as possible, but also be able to bring it back into sources where it can be useful and apply to that big data, that can often come with resistance within an organization. If we just put ourselves in the shoes of someone like maintenance and operations, like, but I always call the networking team. Why do I have to fill out this form all of a sudden? And what we noticed as we worked with these different types of stakeholders is, first, there was an element of making it even easier for them to contact that person in the first place. So pointing out how, look, before you had to even just look up this phone number to figure out who to call, and now this is going to live within a Jira site where whenever you're looking up how do I bring on a new device, the form is actually living in the Jira site, and they don't have to use their mental model again and their subconscious to go and figure out who the right person is to call. That's one way. And then more generally, we were able to provide a lot more visibility into the process, and they started to see those benefits as well. So when you think about, hey, I'm reaching out to networking team, I need this online in 15 minutes, but it's actually going to be 7 days before you ever see this device come online. It's a really frustrating process when they're trying to get their own job done. And when you bring this into a system, not only are you sharing that data, but they're getting that visibility of here's who we're waiting on for approvals, here's who still hasn't filled out the form, and that becomes way more informative to everybody, including the person who's filling out the form in the first place, and that helps provide the buy-in, because if you skip that process, then you're gonna skip the benefits later on. And then there's one more way that we've seen play out, which is that spider web effect of how this has these real network effects and grows over time. And for devices that didn't have this form filled out, there was additional controls you could put in and benefits you could get, such as if a device doesn't have a form filled out, it wouldn't be given network access, so you can kind of use controls that way, so they kind of had to put it into place. There were a couple methods that we used, but those are just a few examples. Absolutely. Grayson.
Fascinating talk. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with the big data mindset, and you're showing that as far as little data problems. What's the most interesting near miss that you've seen so far as it pertains to maybe a small little data issue that could become a larger impact for an organization? I know oftentimes maybe the business unit that owns the little data problem doesn't necessarily communicate to the people that are protecting or securing it. Is there any lessons from the field that you've seen that are near misses that could potentially help others?
Wow, so many. I think the biggest one is the accountability around people. So I could give numerous examples of the facilities manager who calls the HVAC guy every time, and that doesn't exist. That's not documented anywhere. I've seen entire hospital wings go down and them not able to bring them back online until they got everybody in the room to talk about what they were respectively seeing. And the list kind of goes on, but in general, I think the ability not just to know ownership, like that's great, but there's so many other relationships that people are having to different devices, and that can span just from within an organization and also outside of an organization, vendors, separate, even government entities. And those are some of the big examples where I would recommend people start if you're trying to get your head wrapped around it. Good? All right, thank you, everyone.